Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to kick us off. I assume that as I'm talking, more folks will join us, but I have lots of things to say, so I may as well get started. Good afternoon. My name is Ariel Cates. I'm the Director of Marketing at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in our 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism through time, and stories of resistance against injustice, among many other things. I'm so glad that you are here to join us in celebrating LGBTQ plus History Month on this very dreary day, and the release of the new book, Pink Triangle Legacies. I have put the link to purchase the book along with a very special discount code into the chat. So please use that, and I'll also put it in the chat a bunch of times throughout the talk, so don't worry. So Pink Triangle Legacies draws from unexplored archival sources and original interviews, shining a light on LGBTQ plus Holocaust victims and the transformation of the symbol of the pink triangle in the years following the Holocaust. We are so glad to delve into this history and to present so many perspectives and experiences and ways of talking about this topic that I think is, dear to each of us who are here in our own different ways. It can be tricky to talk about people in the past with contemporary language that didn't exist at the time. That's something that we talk about a bunch at the museum, and so I'm grateful to be continuing that conversation and navigating that with all of you here today. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Jake Newsome. Jake is a scholar of American and German LGBTQ plus history, whose work as a public historian reaches global audiences. He earned his PhD in history from the State University of New York at Buffalo in 2016. He has published in academic journals, as well as popular outlets like the Washington Post, and has appeared as a guest on multiple podcasts, including Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness. His new book, Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, was just published by Cornell University Press. Yay. In addition to serving as a historical advisor for film projects, exhibits, and plays, Dr. Newsome has been invited by the French, UK, and US governments to speak about the important lessons that LGBTQ plus history has for all of us today. He now works as a museum professional in Washington, DC. And so I'm so glad to have you here joining our museum today. Just a little bit of Zoom protocol. Closed captions are available. I put some instructions on how to access those in the chat, in addition to many other links, which I will continue to post. I'm going to go off camera, but I will be here in the chat for any thoughts or needs that you all might have. If you have any questions for Jake specifically, please, I just ask that you submit those through the Q&A function. You can do that at any time during the talk. The Q&A just helps me to keep track of your questions. So thanks again so much. And Jake, take us away.
All right. Well, thank you, Ariel, for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for logging on this afternoon. As Ariel mentioned, and at least I know down here in DC, it is very, very cold and windy and dreary. So it's nice to be inside and warm and in this digital space with all of you. It is just truly an honor to be invited by the world-renowned Museum of Jewish Heritage here to speak with all of you about my new book. I really do appreciate the invitation. It's been great getting to know Ariel and her team, and as we've been putting this event together. We are gathered together here at a moment in American history in which we're engaged in a national debate about access to information, right? Whether it's politicians' speeches or local school board meetings, they're all dominated, at least it seems like that, by proposals for book bans and curriculum review, and debates about which topics are age appropriate to be taught, whether it's in the history classroom or in health, English, or any other classrooms. And although it's in a different historical context, these questions really are at the heart of my new book, of Pink Triangle Legacies. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I guess I'll start towards the beginning. When I was a college student, which I like to think was not that long ago, but as I'm reminded by the calendar, actually was over a decade ago, I took every course that was offered by my university on the Holocaust, on Nazi Germany, World War II. And by the end of my time at college, with the naivety of a college student, I felt that clearly I must know every single thing that there was to know about the Holocaust. But it was not until the very end of my time as a college student, a guest lecturer came to campus and gave a presentation on the men with the pink triangle. And so these were, the prisoners in Nazi concentration camps who were marked by a pink triangle badge for being gay. And it struck me that I had gone through these 4 years, and of course there was always a list in the books, that kind of listed almost by bullet point other non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust that always included, homosexuals or Roma and Sinti. But I realized that I didn't know much beyond that bullet point. And this was especially shocking to me since at the time I was personally going through a journey of coming out and trying to figure out where do I fit in the gay community, but also in history more broadly. And so when I did finally begin asking my professors about this topic, I was told that the Nazis' LGBTQ victims were one of the so-called forgotten victim groups, and that after the Holocaust was over and after the war was over, homosexuality remained such a taboo topic that no one talked about it. This included, the gay survivors themselves, but also what the German society. And so at the time, that made sense to me, because how can you write a history with no evidence? But I went to graduate school and thought that, okay, I'm going to be the very first one to ever think about, research this topic and finally break the silence. And so I went to the archives in Germany, really expecting to find nothing on the topic. And so you can imagine my surprise then when I found mountains and mountains of material from gay survivors themselves, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, in whether it was diary entries or letters, but also government records from law enforcement, from the Ministry of Justice in West Germany, from journalists. And so really kind of there was just a plethora of information of not only about what happened to LGBTQ folks during the Nazi regime, but also what happened to them afterwards. And so as my German language skills also improved, I realized that there was a very nascent scholarship on the topic as well, that beginning in the late 1970s, a handful of, I would say, grassroots activist scholars in West Germany had begun to go into the archives and began publishing a handful of scholarly works on the topic. So then this led me to a new set of questions, primarily, how did I, in 2009, spend 4 years studying the topic and still not, that this information had not made its way into mainstream Holocaust education all of these many decades later. And so that new question really became the kernel, the heart of this new book. And so again, what began as a question about what happened to LGBTQ people during the Holocaust became a project about how society ultimately chose to purposefully forget the Nazis' LGBTQ victims, and of course, all of the devastating consequences that that had. But this book at the same time also became a history about the perseverance of the LGBTQ community, right? Who did not let the oppression of society stop them from diving into the archives, from marching in the streets, and ultimately from writing their own history, even while the professional historians tried to silence them. So to trace this history, which evolved and grew and came to span almost 90 years and 2 continents, I traced the history of a symbol that was at the heart of it all, and that was the Pink Triangle. But before this afternoon, before I can talk about the Pink Triangle's legacies, I need to speak briefly about the Pink Triangle's origins. Well, if I can get this to proceed, I will do that. There we go. So by the 1930s in Germany, the small right-wing fringe party called the Nazi Party had already begun to gain considerable power throughout the country. And in 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest political party in the German parliament. And in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of the nation. Now, this new Nazi government wanted to create a so-called racially pure society. And it labeled several groups as not belonging to this new German community that they sought to establish. So according to their ideology, some groups like Jews, like Roma and Sinti, and even Germans with disabilities were seen as possessing a deep biological flaw, right? And not only a flaw, but a threat to the so-called master race. And again, according to Nazi ideology, these groups could not be changed, could not be cured, and therefore posed a existential threat to the German society. The Nazis also believed that other groups were enemies of the state. For example, political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, folks that we would today call members of the LGBTQ community, and others. And so they were perceived as dangerous, but the Nazis also believed that they could force these groups to change their behavior and then reintegrate them back into German society. Now, the Nazis were obsessed with understanding and then controlling human sexuality. Indeed, that was key, right, to breeding the so-called master race. Another thing that I would like to point out here is that the Nazis did not believe that people were born gay or born on the LGBTQ spectrum. They believed that it was a choice. And therefore, the Nazis focused their efforts on trying to force people to quit and give up this alleged vice. So the policies, the Nazis' policies against LGBTQ folks never evolved into mass murder, but the Nazis did envision a new Germany that was completely free of what they called the homosexual lifestyle. And that meant, even if it meant killing individuals who would not or could not give up the lifestyle and conform to the Nazi ideals. So as we'll see, even though the Nazis did not seek to murder every single LGBTQ person, they certainly established a program of cultural genocide to completely remove, again, what they called the homosexual lifestyle. And one of the first things that the Nazis did upon coming to power was try to control access to information. They banned LGBTQ publications. They burned over 20,000 books from the Institute for sexual science during the famous book burnings in May of 1933. This was an institute that was really world renowned and unique in the world, in that it collected incredibly rare artifacts and documents of LGBTQ culture and history. The Nazis also shut down all of the different bars and clubs and political organizations, first in Berlin as the capital of the country, but then in waves across the rest of the nation. Now, the Nazis targeted anyone whose gender or sexuality didn't conform to their traditional ideals, but they did view queer men as the most dangerous within the LGBTQ community, because it's really because men in Germany had access to authority, right? They had access to positions of influence, and therefore they could allegedly more easily damage whether it was the economy or the military or national politics. So the Nazis did focus most of their efforts on queer men, but of course this does not mean that queer women did not or were not persecuted. We'll see that thousands upon thousands of queer women were caught up in the Nazi apparatus and even sent to concentration camps. But the Nazis, at least policy-wise, were not looking quite as hard for queer women as they were for queer men. Now, paragraph 175, which you see here on your screen, was the Nazis' most valuable tool in their campaign against homosexuality. The law had existed in Germany since 1871, so it predated the Nazis, and was used to criminalize so-called unnatural indecency between two men. But the Nazis felt that the way that the original law was worded was too constricting. So in 1935, during the same months that they were writing the infamous Nuremberg race laws, they also decided to amend paragraph 175. And this is the new version that you can see on the screen. So the law criminalized indecency. And you may be asking yourself, how is that defined? And that was actually exactly the point, that the term was left broad enough that prosecutors and judges could interpret that term however they saw fit, with the ultimate goal of arresting as many gay men as possible. Now, one of the things that has stood out to me from the research is the way that it seems that most Germans agreed with the Nazis' war against LGBTQ folks. The historical records demonstrate quite clearly that they used their voices to activate the violence and the power of the regime against queer people in staggering numbers. So, for example, we know that out of all of the paragraph 175 cases that not only went to court but ended in a conviction, 1/3 of them were the result of civilian denunciations. So whether this was co-workers or neighbors or bosses, sometimes even family members turning in gay men and women to the Nazis. In total, the Nazis arrested about 100,000 men under paragraph 175. We don't yet have accurate statistics on the total number of queer women who were arrested, because there wasn't a single law against queer women in the same way that paragraph 175 was just for queer men. And so scholars are working on it, but are still working to kind of combine the arrest records from the various laws and policies that the Nazis used to target queer women. Now, out of those 100,000 men who were arrested, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 so-called repeat offenders were sent to concentration camps. These were men who were arrested more than once, or in some rare cases, also men who might have only been arrested once, but whom the Nazis deemed posed a particular threat to the rest of society for any number of reasons. So when individuals were sent to concentration camps, they were labeled with a colored triangle badge on their uniform that marked their so-called crime, right? Why the Nazis had imprisoned them. And so for men who were imprisoned for being gay, their colored badge was the pink triangle. Now, lesbians and transgender and also gender nonconforming people were, as documented, were sent to concentration camps, but they did not have a specific or separate category within the badge marketing system. So we know that most of the times these other queer folks were forced to wear the black triangle, which was the badge for so-called asocials. So this was a kind of miscellaneous category for anyone that the Nazi regime deemed a social deviant. So this included sex workers, people with alcoholism, homeless people, drug users. So again, kind of a catch-all category. And this is where a lot of lesbians and transgender people were also categorized. Now, in the camp system, Pink Triangle prisoners were, and this is according to evidence from gay survivors themselves, but also from Nazi guards and other prisoners, that the Pink Triangle prisoners were subjected to harder work details because hard work was supposedly masculine. And this hard masculine work would supposedly reorient gay men back to being straight. And gay men prisoners were also subjected to really gruesome medical experiments that were aimed at supposedly finding a biological cure to their disease. Now, all of this kind of highlights the Nazis' official policy, which again was to cure or re-educate these men in the homosexual lifestyle and then reintegrate them back into German society. But we also need to keep in mind the difference between policy and reality, because despite this official policy, over 2/3 of gay prisoners were killed in the camps. And so this is an incredibly high death rate, really only second after those groups like Jews, Roma and Sinti, and people with disabilities who were labeled for physical genocide and mass murder. Now, after the Allies defeated Germany in May of 1945, they were left with the task of caring for the hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors. And led by the Americans, the Allies adopted a policy of releasing prisoners who had been incarcerated based on their religion, their race, or their political or ideological beliefs. But they said common criminals it was too dangerous to release common criminals back into the general public. And because the men with the pink triangle had technically broken a national law that predated the Nazi regime, the Allies treated pink triangle prisoners as common criminals. So any gay man who still had any time left on his sentence was taken from the liberated concentration camp and transferred immediately to a local prison where they were forced to serve out the rest of any of the term that they had left on their prison sentence. At the same time, the Allies also sought to purge all of the Nazi laws from the German Constitution and the German Criminal Code, but they left it up to the Germans themselves to decide what to do with paragraph 175. Again, remember, this is the version that the Nazis had amended a decade before in 1935. So when Communist East Germany and Democratic West Germany were both created in 1949, both new nations had the Nazi version of paragraph 175 written into their new criminal codes. Pierre Ciel, who was a gay Frenchman who had been thrown into a concentration camp during the German occupation of France, stated very powerfully after the end of the war that liberation was only for others. Now, beginning immediately after the creation of West Germany, gay people challenged the legality of paragraph 175 in court. Right? They argued that it went against the new democratic constitution for West Germany to continue using this Nazi version of an already discriminatory law. but the West German court system continuously rebuked any claims that fascism lived in this law. And in fact, in 1957, the West German Constitutional Court ruled once and for all that the country would keep the Nazi version of paragraph 175. And they didn't just keep it, they used it extensively. So if you remember that graph that I showed you a few slides ago of the annual convictions under paragraph 175, if you extended that to look at the first decades of West Germany's existence, this is what it would look like. So in the first 20 years of its existence, West Germany used the Nazi law to arrest 100,000 queer men who were living in the new Federal Republic. This led the historian and theologian Hans-Joachim Schoeps to claim as late as 1963 that for homosexuals, the Third Reich hasn't ended yet. But it was not just in debates around the legality of paragraph 175 where Germans discussed the Nazis' LGBTQ victims. They also discussed these victims during the debates around compensation, right? The official acknowledgement and then compensation of the Nazis' victims. So here on your screen, you can see a letter written by a man named Bruno Bouchard, who had survived 4 years in prison during the Nazi regime after being arrested for paragraph 175. So after the war was over and the Nazis were defeated, he applies to become officially recognized as a victim of the Nazi regime. But the governing council of the local board there in Berlin denied his application and stated very explicitly that they were denying his application because he was gay. But Bruno does something that was pretty unique, at least unique in the historical record, is that he appealed the decision and left quite a rare paper trail for a historian like myself to be able to then find in the archives and piece together his story. So this is left, he's underlined a particular passage which I have translated here for you. He talks about the fact that he was a political opponent to the Nazis, but he says, I would just like to point out my castration, which was demanded of me in the detention center, although I was never convicted by a proper court because I had instead been taken to a camp. Such a brutal intrusion on a healthy human body was only possible in Nazi Germany and should be enough to convince you that I was a victim of fascism. Unfortunately, the council was not convicted. They denied Bruno Bouchard again, but also sent the police after him. Again, as I said, paragraph 175 was still in effect. Fortunately, Bruno was not rearrested, at least at this particular time. But unfortunately, this is where the historical record goes cold, and we don't know what happened to him after that. Now, Bruno was not alone. No LGBTQ victims were officially acknowledged or given compensation as Nazi victims during this period because, quite simply, they were not considered victims at all. So as I said at the beginning of my talk, the LGBTQ victim, or this group, has often been called one of the forgotten victims. But I think one of the things that my research and the Pink Triangle Legacies book demonstrates is that no one had forgotten the Nazis' LGBTQ victims. Germans knew what had happened to them, and in many cases agreed with what the Nazis had done to queer people. They, as not only as kind of members of normal society, but also the politicians and lawmakers continued to discriminate against and persecute queer people well after the Nazis' defeat. So some men, like Bruno, broke their silence and told their story, but those with more power in positions of authority told him essentially to be quiet because he was not a real victim. But also the stifling environment of homophobia forced most men to keep their memories hidden, never to speak of them, even to their own families. So writing this book has taught me a lot about the nature of silence. When I started, I thought about silence as a noun, right? The absence of something, the absence of sound, or in this case, the absence of memory. But what we see here is silence as a verb, right? To silence, to keep someone quiet. West German politicians and judges and historians, journalists, and the general public silenced the Nazis' LGBTQ victims for decades. But by the 1970s, gay activists were about to break that silence once and for all. So in the summer of 1969, the West German parliament finally amended paragraph 175, and they didn't do this because they were pro-gay rights by any means, but essentially too many people had accused them of not learning from their Nazi past. And so the new version of the law, which again went into effect in 1969, essentially legalized being gay among men over the age of 21. But this still represented discrimination because it was a higher age of consent than which was set for straight people. But either way, this paved the way for the emergence of a political gay rights movement. And activists in this new gay movement sought to mobilize queer people across the nation into political action. During this time, coming out and publicly claiming a gay identity was seen as both a pivotal step towards personal liberation from the closet, but also as a necessary political step towards ending social discrimination against LGBTQ folks more broadly. So West German gay activists suggested that they out themselves by wearing a gay symbol, which raised a lot of questions, like what would this gay symbol be? But in 1972, a publisher in Hamburg released a short book that would ultimately have a monumental impact. Written under the pseudonym Heinz Hager, it was the first book by a gay concentration camp survivor to tell their story. And the title of the book, The Men with the Pink Triangle, offered a solution to the gay movement's problem of visibility. Activists knew that West Germans would instantly recognize the Pink Triangle as a concentration camp badge, and thus be faced with the fact that their recent history wasn't completely in the past. In March of 1972, a group in Frankfurt called Rot-Schwul became the very first gay group in the world to use the Pink Triangle in the context of gay rights activism. But the Gay Action Group of West Berlin, abbreviated in German as HAAW, was the nation's largest and most influential of the gay groups, and they soon adopted the logo as well. But they knew that it was never just a political tool, that this represented a fundamental transformation of a particular symbol, but also of an identity as well. So the original Pink Triangle had labeled being gay as something that was criminal and worth punishing. But these activists in the 70s reclaimed the Pink Triangle and said that being gay is in no way shameful. Right? So they sought to rob the Pink Triangle of its negative power by saying essentially that being gay is not an insult anymore. And in fact, we're going to wear this badge as a symbol of pride. During my research, Peter Heidenstrom, who was one of the founding members of the HAAW, explained to me that the use of the Pink Triangle signaled both an individual's choice to come out, but also represented a coming out of sorts of this chapter of history that had been silenced for decades. Now, the public display and use of the Pink Triangle signaled a break with past gay activism. So through arguments that were based on the right to privacy, previous generations had helped establish the metaphorical closet as a necessary safe space for queer people, essentially to hide from governmental punishment. But beginning in the 1970s, the Pink Triangle sought to tear the closet door off its hinges. So when wearing pink triangles on pins and plastering it on park benches and trains and flyers all over West Germany, gay activists asserted that citizens in a democratic society had the fundamental right to express their sexuality freely and openly. Now, the reclamation of the Pink Triangle originated in West Germany, but it didn't stay there for very long. In August of 1974, the Gay Activists Alliance in New York City planned a rally in support of a gay rights bill that was up for debate in the city council. Led by activists David Thorstad and John Lauritsen, the GAA designed and wore these buttons that you see here on the screen. This ultimately became the first documented instance of the pink triangle's use in political activism in the United States. From there, it spread across the country. Gay activists used the pink triangle and the history that it represented to call out homophobia and to promote legal equality. And they did so, as we saw, from New York, but also to Miami, San Francisco, and really everywhere in between. And in the United States as well, gay activists understood their using of the pink triangle as a transformation of something that was negative into something that was really powerfully positive. And the Jewish and lesbian activist Martha Shelley told me in an interview that the pink triangle had the added benefit of giving the middle finger to the Nazis. By the early 1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widely used and widely recognizable symbol of gay rights activism across North America and Europe. As you can see from just a sampling of memorabilia here, it resonated with communities from multiple ethnicities and backgrounds, and also of various gender identities and sexual orientations. In 1986, a group of activist artists in New York City catapulted the pink triangle into the public consciousness in a new way when they designed the now iconic Silence Equals Death poster to motivate people to take action during the deadly AIDS crisis. And after the AIDS activist group ACT UP adopted the poster, the pink triangle became a visible symbol all across the globe. But the pink triangle was never only about politics. Transgender activist Nancy Nangeroni, who you see here, used symbolism as a means of bridge building. So as she told me in an interview, there was a lot of homophobia in the trans community back in the 1990s and transphobia in the gay community. So she tried to build solidarity among the two communities by creating this pin that you see here that combined the symbolism of the transgender symbol as well as the pink triangle. Intersectionality also prompted Jose Gutierrez to form Triangulo Rosa, which was a gay support group for Latino gay men and lesbians in Washington, DC. And Jose has since become a dear friend, and he speaks so beautifully about what the pink triangle meant to him, as a Mexican American, even though he had no direct connections to its origins in German history. So he explained how he felt connected to the pink triangle because the symbol had come to represent a gay community and indeed a gay identity that transcended national borders and shared a history together. So this history was also vitally important for Black and queer writer Cheryl Head. Back in the early 1980s, she traveled to Israel for a work assignment, and while there, she visited Yad Vashem, and she told me about how she can still remember the feeling of standing in shock as she read about the badging system that the Nazis had for the concentration camp prisoners, and learning specifically about the pink triangle. Later, when she returned to the United States, she saw the pink triangle again, but this time on the famous Silence Equals Death poster. But she did mention that this poster would not have been as meaningful to her if she had not already learned about the history of the symbol, or the history behind the symbol. But unfortunately, that history was still at that time largely unwritten and indeed under attack. The archives in West Germany, as well as professional historians, museums, academic journals, all refused to study or give space to the topic. And as late as 1996, this is what you can see the news clipping here on your screen, a state archive in Hamburg got caught destroying case files on the Nazis' gay victims in order to make room for what it called more archive-worthy material. Now, since the 1970s, a handful of grassroots scholars have risked their reputations and their livelihoods to research this history when no one else would. In the early years, there was really very little distinction between kind of scholar and activist, and it was the same people who were rummaging around in the archives who were also marching in the streets. So when the historical profession shut out the LGBTQ community, queer people set out to write their history for themselves. And to this day, It's still a very small group of us who are preserving and researching and writing this history. And my own book would most certainly not be possible without the work of the people that you see here on the screen. In 2002, the German government finally recognized the men persecuted under paragraph 175 as official victims of the Nazi regime. This also meant that they were finally eligible for compensation. Yet at that point, no gay survivors came forward. At the time, the youngest would have been at least 80 years old. And for their entire lives, Germany had told them that they were unworthy of being recognized or compensated. So to this day, not a single cent of official compensation has been granted by the German government to the Nazis' gay victims. Now, up until now, the memorials and debates about compensation have revolved around paragraph 175 and the Pink Triangle prisoners, which of course were all men. This has led to several outcomes. Number one, that queer women were not eligible and still remain ineligible for compensation. And that second, it was only earlier this year, in April of 2022, was there a permanent memorial to the lesbian victims first established in Germany, actually at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. So this is a history that is still being debated. And now we come to the conclusion of my talk this evening. If you asked anyone what the symbol of the LGBTQ community today is, you would probably be very hard pressed to find anyone who would give the answer of the Pink Triangle. Really today, the rainbow flag is the predominant symbol of the global LGBTQ community. But in a lot of ways, the origin of the rainbow was a direct antithesis or the direct opposite of the Pink Triangle. In 1978, Harvey Milk and San Francisco artist activist Gilbert Baker decided they wanted something with soul, something more uplifting for the upcoming Gay Pride Parade that year. And Baker at the time even said, "You're right, we only have the Pink Triangle, which comes from the Holocaust and Hitler. We need something uplifting, something happy." So what he created was the very first rainbow flag that flew in 1978. And since then, the rainbow has achieved a level of visibility beyond the queer community that the Pink Triangle just never did. But I would argue that in order for it to become so widespread, it has also been tamed and made more acceptable to the mainstream. And in a lot of ways, this gay pride symbol has been turned into nothing more than a PR tool or a marketing tactic. Each June, corporations turn their logos into rainbows, and they may even showcase a same-sex couple in their advertisements, and they make lots of money, leaving a lot of us to question where they are when state governments begin dismantling LGBTQ rights. July comes around and the rainbows disappear. But despite the cliches, there's not always a rainbow after the storm. LGBTQ folks were among the communities that the Nazis first targeted because they knew that doing so would help win votes and give them the political power that they so desperately wanted. Today, it's not a coincidence that we're seeing a resurgence of white supremacy, extreme nationalism, book banning, and the absolute worst year on record for anti-LGBTQ legislation in this country. Protecting traditional values and parents' rights in the classrooms often are used as dog whistles to unify conservatives who might not otherwise agree on anything else, similar tactics to those that were used in the 1920s. So in today's era of Republicans don't say gay laws, we need the Pink Triangle more than ever. Because if we are truly to honor those who originally wore the Pink Triangle, either those who had no choice and were forced to wear it in the concentration camps, or even those who first reclaimed it and wore it with pride, we have to commit to action. We have to turn our queer ancestors' wildest dreams into a reality on a daily basis. The LGBTQ community today has every right to exist, not just quietly in the closet, but visibly, including in books, in history curriculum, in film, TV shows, every single way that we talk about and understand the world. We all have to collectively fight to protect that right, because the Pink Triangle warns us what happens if we don't. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jake. I appreciate all of this very much. And thanks to all of you who are here with us. I appreciate all of the questions that we've gotten so far. Please feel free to keep them coming. I'm just gonna dive right into them. We have a question about, we have a couple of questions about the history. There's a question about paragraph 175 in Austria.
Mm,
Um,
okay.
and about differences in that in the language of different paragraphs, laws that were used in different places that were ultimately under Nazi occupation. Also, let's see. We've got some questions about compensation, which I can ask you later. And we've also got a great question from Tammy, which is, why was homosexuality considered okay for some of the top Nazis like Ernest
Mm,
Röhm?
mhm,
Also, Ilse Koch, who was
mm.
a woman concentration camp guard who was rumored to be queer. Great questions, Tammy. Let's start with those.
Sure. So I will say, I'll try to answer the one about paragraph 175, kind of in the annexed territories first. Austria was unique in the fact that they already had their own national anti-gay law on the books, even before the Nazis came. And what was interesting about, well, noteworthy about theirs is that it did apply both to men and women. And for the life of me, I cannot remember. I think it was called paragraph 219, but don't quote me on that one. It was different. And so when the Nazis did annex Austria, essentially both paragraph 175 and the Austrian law were kind of kept on the books side by side for a while, because essentially, even though technically like all of the German laws superseded the Austrian laws at the time, and it was up to kind of the Germans were like, well, we can really just choose to enforce whichever one that might fit our needs better at that particular time. Ultimately, paragraph 175 did kind of come to replace the Austrian one. So Austria is that unique the unique case study. Essentially, when Germany invaded other countries, especially in the East, they weren't very interested in enforcing anti-gay laws, because essentially this all comes down to racism. They believed that they only cared about preserving the sexual and racial superiority of the German people, and so they just kind of assumed that it was only natural for these so-called lesser races to engage in something like homosexuality. And so in some cases where the law is applied in the East, it's usually because usually a German soldier, was caught sleeping with a Czech or a Polish man, and a lot of times it was only the German that would get in trouble, because it was again trying to police their behavior. So I will say, to the topic of homosexuality in the Nazi Party, just more generally, that just as the case where today, where queer people have a number of different political beliefs or racial ideologies, that's the same in 1930s Germany, and so we have to also understand that there were queer people who also were anti-Semitic, who were racist, and were drawn to Nazi ideology. An absolute great example of that is, I think you said it was Tammy mentioned Ernst Röhm, who was, one of the most hardcore Nazis that there were. He actually joined the party before Hitler, and so he was one. I think he was like the third highest ranking person. He was ahead of the stormtroopers, and Hitler even personally tried to shield Ernst Röhm from criticism, until Röhm became a political liability, when even parties on the left and the right were criticizing the Nazis for saying that they were going to clean up Germany's, decayed morals and go after homosexuality, but then also having a very openly gay, such a high-ranking leader. And so at that point, when he became a liability, then Hitler had him ousted and murdered. But that was, so there are all these tensions and contradictions in propaganda and ideology on the one hand, and then reality on the other. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, we have a couple of just clarifying questions. Michael is asking you to repeat the name of the first group in Germany to use the triangle.
Oh, yeah. So it is Rot Schwul. So I'll put it in the chat. This was a group in Frankfurt. So let me find the chat button, and I will do that. There it is. And there's actually a really good, if you read German, there's a really good book that came out about the group not very long ago. I think just about 3 or 4 years ago.
Thanks. Yeah, and then Mitchell was looking for clarification on, there was a pink triangle that you showed that had a T in it. What does the T stand for?
So the T in that case was probably the German for Czech, which would be Chechen. So that probably was that particular triangle that I showed was unused. The liberating soldiers found it unused at Buchenwald, if I'm not mistaken. And so the estimation is that was probably going to be then applied to a gay prisoner of Chechenian or Czech ethnicity. Yeah.
Got it. So much iconography. We have a question from Susanna, who says thanks, and also wants to know, what do you see as the primary political function of homophobia in the Third Reich? And she also asks, how did this change or stay the same after the establishment of East and West Germany, which I know we were talking about earlier?
No, that's a great question, because it kind of, homophobia is nebulous enough that it can be used to kind of fit different situations, and as I mentioned, to unify factions that otherwise might not agree on particular policy issues. So for the Nazis, I mean, homophobia was racialized, just the way that anti-Semitism was racialized. And it was all about the, posing homophobia not just as a religious or moral affront, posing homosexuality as not just a moral or religious affront, but as a racial threat to the literal reproduction of the fatherland. So that's why in 1936, Himmler established the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion, right? Because they viewed the threat to the German birth rate as went hand in hand between essentially LGBTQ folks and folks who were getting abortions. So it was used, as this way to say that it is an existential threat to the country. It's also a threat to youth. There was a lot of propaganda about how essentially gay people would seduce your sons and daughters into this lifestyle. That particular argument did not change after the war. In West Germany, for example, it became less racial, but more back to rhetoric of sin and immorality. So that homophobia was weaponized that way, to that Germany just went through this horrible shattering experience, and we need to rebuild the kind of core family, which consists of a mother and a father and children. And so actually, in a lot of ways, some of the arguments of West Germany was that that the country had just lost so many men during the war that we need to repopulate the country, which they never used the terms like eugenics or race, but again, very much eerily reminiscent
Yes.
of the arguments that the Nazis made.
Yes. Okay, so two questions about compensation. Are relatives of LGBTQ victims able to apply for that? And also, what is the significance of that compensation? Like, I mean, how much, yes, but also,
Sure.
in terms of, talking about reparations and things like that.
I mean, I think, most people, and it is a moral question, right? Of that's why even in Germany, in German, right, the term for essentially compensation, reparations is Wiedergutmachung, right? A making good again. And so that this idea that there's more of it's not just a financial transaction, but also a seeking a moral atonement and to make something good again for a wrong that has been done in the past. To help answer that question, I will give one quick example of in the 1980s, the West German government said that they would give some financial aid to people like the LGBTQ community and the Roma and Sinti who were originally not part of the official compensation. But they explicitly said, this will only be financial aid, essentially charity that we're giving you. It's not to be seen as official compensation or an admission of guilt. And so there
Right.
were about like 10 to 13 men who received like a small one-time payment from that 1980s legislation. But again, that was not official compensation. And then, as I said, by the time that official compensation opened up, no one came forward to claim it for a number of different reasons.
I appreciate that. Thanks. We have a question from Mitchell. Do you think that the how many Nazis became a part of the German legal system after the war? Do you think that played a role in retaining paragraph 175?
Absolutely, and that's something that I wish I had statistics on. That's always like I always make myself a post-it note of like what actually was the percentage of people that retained their jobs, and I absolutely do think that was played a fundamental role in keeping the law, keeping specifically the Nazi version of the law in the post-war period. There is a really chilling example of a guy named Karl Garath, he survived 6 years in camps because of paragraph 175. He was rearrested again in Frankfurt in 1951, and he was horrified to witness when he got to the courtroom that the same judge that was presiding over his 1951 case was also the judge that had sent him to the camps under the Nazi regime. And his lawyer actually said, "Judge, you know this man, he's already served a lot of time in a camp, so maybe we can apply that time as time served for this new infraction." And the judge actually
God.
says, "Absolutely not. You should have learned your lesson." And he gives him the maximum sentence. And so this guy then spends another 5 years in prison after, from the same judge.
Wow, great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we have a bunch more questions, but I just I wanted to ask you something that I noticed while you were talking, especially about on the silence equals death poster, but also, in some of the other more modern and contemporary uses of the pink triangle. There's this directional thing, and also there are like all these different kinds of pink. So can you talk a little bit, just like from a symbology perspective, like what was happening with that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's I'm trained more as, like, I guess, a traditional historian. So, like, to me, I had my ideas of like why the triangle might be pointing up. To me, fuchsia and pink, it was just all the same. And so I actually had a chance to interview two of the original members of the Silence Equals Death collective who designed the poster. And so, I was asking them about them designing the pink triangle poster, and they were like, whoa, 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 it's fuchsia, it's not pink. There's a very particular
Huh?
reason why we chose fuchsia. It's more aggressive. It's not, we didn't want baby pink. And so then I asked about the peak of that triangle facing upwards. And this is just one of those really serendipitous examples from history. The collective had designed the poster and already plastered it all over New York City in March of 1987. But they got to a couple of gay bookshops and stores that actually told them that they would not hang the poster up. And they were like, oh my gosh, why? This is to help our community, fight against AIDS. And they said, oh, because the triangle is facing the wrong way. That's not historically accurate. And
Wow.
and apparently one of the group members, it was their job to go research which way the original badges faced in the camp system, but they didn't do that. And so it was pointing up, and now the group was like, okay, we just spent all this money. Do we reprint them? And one of the members said, you know what, why don't we just own it? Like, it was a mistake, but we don't have to advertise that. We'll just say that we turned it upwards as a way to kind of call people to action and point towards, a brighter, better future. It should be maybe more uplifting. And so, yeah, then that's how the upward facing triangle on the Silence Equals Death poster was born by an accident, but ultimately came to have a big impact.
Wow, that's so amazing. I really appreciate that. And we have a shout out from Alan to the German film called Great Freedom, which apparently
Mhm.
also talks about this. So in our follow-up email, we always try to include things that, might be interesting to explore on the same topic. So I'll try to find some information about that and pass that along to everybody. So thanks, Alan, for that tip.
Yeah.
Um, and I just want to, I know we're a little bit over, but I just wanted to ask you one more question, which is what brought you to this writing? I mean, this is a big project. I'm just, I'm always sort of curious when scholars undertake things like this. What what is
Yeah.
the what is the inspiration for you?
I came to this topic through the lens of queer history, actually. As I mentioned, as an undergraduate, I was studying Holocaust history. Um, I myself am not Jewish. I don't have kind of my family weren't liberators. I don't have a direct kind of family connection to the Holocaust. But I did. Um, I started studying it because one semester I just needed an extra elective, and the one that was available was History of the Holocaust, and I took it, and it just rocked my world, because I had in high school we didn't learn about it, um, and so I felt, how could this have happened in humanity, and and I didn't learn about it. And so that put me on the path of learning Holocaust history. At the same time, again, as I said, I was coming out and wanting to learn more about LGBT history, and eventually these two passions merged. And as I started then learning about LGBTQ Nazi victims, um, to be honest, even though I didn't know the details about it, it wasn't super shocking to me that the Nazis targeted LGBTQ people, because right, they targeted so many different groups. But it was learning what happened to the victims afterwards that really shook me. And the first time I found a piece of archival evidence to show that they were re-imprisoned or denied compensation, I thought that must have been a fluke. But then as I looked, I just kept finding more and more and more. And so that is, the fact that history was silenced and allowed this persecution to continue. I just knew that I needed to be the one to help those people tell their stories, and hopefully teach us a lesson that historical silencing is dangerous and can even be deadly.